Okay, so let me start in then on the conceptual issues. Very briefly on the role and functions of land. I would note that besides just the impacts that land have on the ability of rural households to feed themselves and get incomes for their families, there's also a kind of a social security element to this, as well as home for retirement. So while many economists, like myself, would look at alternative land strategies insofar as they affect incomes and welfare for the greatest number of people, there are these other kind of non-tangible benefits that tend to not be factored in. They have intergenerational aspects to them. Inheritance and so forth. And there's some intrinsic value of land as well that's sort of captured in point number 3 and 4. So the other question under conceptual things is, how does land policy affect agricultural development? Certainly land policy can affect the structure of agriculture. And as I said a moment ago, Africa has generally been conceived of as 95% of the farming population are small-scale farmers between 0 and 5 hectares. And I'm going to show that that may be changing rapidly. And if farm structure changes rapidly, then the beneficiaries of agricultural price policy and trade policy can change as well. So much of the benefits of agricultural policy are linked to who sells the most. And if farm structure changes in a way that favors large farms at the expense of small farms, then there are impacts here that need to be accounted for and, and thought through. Farm structure also influences agricultural growth rates itself through this inverse farm size efficiency notion. And let me take a moment to discuss what that is. This inverse farm size efficiency relationship is one that was first documented for Asia in the Green Revolution periods. And the general idea there is that as farm sizes increase, that the level of efficiency per hectare decreases slightly. And what's driving that in the Asian experience was that as farms get larger, they have to hire in labor. And hired labor has supervision costs, so they don't work as hard as own family labor does on their own farms. So that was sort of the explanation for why levels of productivity and efficiency tend to decline as farm sizes increase. So if you were to take that on face value and apply that to Africa, one might think that as farm sizes increase, that maybe the value of output per hectare would also go down. But there's problems with this. First of all, in Asia, a 5-hectare or 10-hectare farm would be considered a big farm. And by African standards, that's not the case. There are farms that are 50, 100, even 5,000 hectares quite commonly. So the real test for Africa would be, how's the relationship between farm size and efficiency over a much wider range of farm sizes than the literature from Asia is able to tell us. So there's work underway on this, but the conceptual point that I'd like to leave you with here is that scale of farming can have a big impact on productivity, and of course land policy will influence that. The inclusiveness of agricultural growth, this harks to the idea of multiplier effects. And for those of you who aren't familiar with multiplier effects, the general notion is this. If there's some stimulus to agriculture so that the beneficiary, the farmers who are benefiting from that, they get more money in their pockets. And of course, farmers will spend their money in certain ways. If it's a small-scale farmer, they tend to recycle that money. They have a high marginal propensity to consume. So for every dollar of additional income they may get through farming, they tend to spend a great deal of that on things like blacksmiths and corrugated iron roofing sheets and veterinary services and so forth, things that stimulate the local economy. So as millions of farmers do that, this tends to stimulate demand and employment effects in the non-farm sector for the blacksmiths and the veterinary services and construction, housing, and so forth. And there are employment benefits that ripple through the economy in that way. Those are called multiplier effects. They tend to be quite high for poor people, and they tend to be lower for people with money. So if you were to contrast agricultural growth multiplier effects between an inclusive kind of farm structure like most of Asia during the time of its Green Revolution, contrast that with latifundia Latin America, where maybe 1 or 2% of all of the farms generated the lion's share of the growth. When wealthy people get extra income, they tend to spend it on imports, educating their kids in elite schools, imported cars, things like that. So the multiplier effects are quite different depending on whether you have a fairly broad-based structure of agriculture, what Bruce Johnston referred to as a unimodal system, or whether you have more of a bimodal system that's common in Latin America. Very different multiplier effects. The last point, I think, under conceptual issues is that there are direct effects resulting from direct employment effects on the farm. So small-scale farming tends to be a fairly labor-intensive form of agriculture. The number of adults who are working per hectare tends to be higher than under a large-scale system. I was speaking to a farmer in South Africa recently who has 1,600 hectares, and he employs 18 workers. So that's about one person per 100 hectares on a grain farm. So many issues will flow from the structure of farming and the scale of farming, direct employment effects, the level of productivity that's generated, and then these multiplier effects. So it becomes very complicated, and there's usually pros and cons associated with different forms of land structure. Okay, this graph to me is a very important one. It shows that Africa is at a point in its demographic situation where 62% of its population are below the age of 25. So what does this have to do with land? Well, in the next 2 decades, I should say, about 350 million young Africans will be entering the job market looking for work. 350 million, that's more than the entire population of the United States. And by even the most favorable projections about non-farm employment growth, roughly half or less of them under the most favorable projections will be able to get wage jobs in the non-farm economy. So this means that the majority of young Africans entering the job market will be dependent on either the informal sector or agriculture as their primary source of employment. And so their ability to obtain and get livelihoods through agriculture will depend on the potential for area expansion, for not only young people to inherit their parents' farms, but to start new farms, and that requires expansion of area as population grows. And I'm going to present some evidence that shows that even in rural Africa, the population in 2050 is going to be 50% higher than it is now. So thinking that through with the demographic changes that the region is going to experience, what does that imply for how policymakers should be thinking about land policy, not just now, but over the next several decades as well, in anticipation of what is coming down the pike? Okay. Why is it important about land security? Land security is the topic of a lot of research. In the 1980s, land security was conceptualized pretty much as privatization, getting title deeds. And the thought was that at that time, if farmers had a title deed over their land, then they would be more likely to invest in it over the course of years and decades with positive effects on productivity. However, in the last several decades, it's become clear that titling is not a panacea, and that many adverse things can happen when land is commodified and kind of privatized as well. And the more recent consensus is that land security is context specific. In some cases, privatization and title deeds registration may be very appropriate. In other cases, that it may not be, and existing traditional tenure structures may actually be superior in terms of protecting land rights for rural people. It's also been found that land security depends decisively on governance and on the views of people who are in authority, what their values are and how they value protecting the rights of rural people. And that it's not intrinsically related to any particular type of tenure structure. So no matter whether you have a title deed or whether the chief says you can use this land or whatever kind of tenure structure, all of them are capable of being corrupted. Or conversely, all of them are capable of protecting the rights of rural people. So it's very context specific.